11. I leaped up from the sofa and sprinted across the dining hall to the door, almost entirely on autopilot. The chilly air of the hallway helped to banish the last lingering embrace of sleep. I pounced towards the window across the hall and stared through the glass down into the courtyard. The first thing I saw was the wide open gates of the castle. The flickering white flashes I saw intermittently coming from there were definitely the visual effects of battle. I pushed open the window, hardly thinking about what I was doing, and the sound of sharp clanging and shouts rose in volume. The servants gathered in the doorway behind me, shrieking. Fighting at the inside of the gates were the familiar dark elf castle guards against a group of black-clad warriors with similar features, but who sported a distinctive face-covering mask. I squinted, focusing on the group, and saw the brightest red cursor appear with the subtitle, Fallen Elven Warrior. Fallen Elves. I had an inkling it was them when I first saw them, but to have it spelled out officially by the system made the shock bigger. They'd led a small ambushes and sneak attacks in the wilderness and dungeons before, but no large-scale assaults like this. They'd kept in the shadows in the background of the struggle between the Forest and the Dark Elves. So why would they lead a head-on invasion of the castle galley? Perhaps the best defend of the Dark Elf strongholds? How had they gotten the guards to open the gates? And I thought the elves weren't supposed to be capable of getting through the barren valley without help. The question came hard and fast, but they weren't going to answer themselves. If I just stood here and watched, I had to make a decision about what to do. For the moment, the invasion seemed to be contained between the castle gates and the spirit tree's pools, but more and more fallen elves were pouring through the open gates by the moment. There had to be 20 at this point, possibly 30. More guards were rushing forth from the palace to defend it, of course, but the fallen seemed more powerful individually. I had a feeling that relying upon the guards to defend this castle might not be a winning strategy. But my highest priority at this moment was the lives of Asuna, Kismel, and Mia. Working backward from that conclusion, I supposed we should try to escape the castle while the guards were still holding back the fallen elves. On the other hand, proud knight Kismel would never flee and abandon her comrades. Asuna would surely want to fight at Kismel's side. In any case, the first step was to regroup with them in the library. I pulled away from the window and began to run. Ah! I heard myself gasp. The dark elf guards fighting in the courtyard's line of defense faltered, 3 of them dropping at once. Their cursors showed their HP at still over half full. I was stunned until I noticed a certain ominous icon blinking below the bars. Paralysis. Some distance away, along the side walls of the castle, a number of enemy-labeled fallen elven scouts were throwing something at the guards. I couldn't see it from here, but I understood instinctually that those were the poison needles again. Dark elf guards had a metal armor on, but it was not full plate. Much of their arms and legs was uncovered, making for easy targets. The hole in the defense line reformed with new guards, and the collapsed members were pulled back to safety. But it was clear that if too many more got paralyzed, the line would quickly crumble. To regroup with Asuna or to rush to the aid of the guards. I myself was paralyzed with the indecision for a moment. Until, at last, I sucked in a deep, sharp breath and broke into action. I opened my window and plopped down onto the ground of the hallway. First, I sent a brief, possibly unnecessary message to Asuna, finish the training, then folded my legs into the Zen lotus position. In real Zen meditation, I was supposed to form an elliptical sign with my hands, but in this world, I simply had to stretch out all of my fingers and place my palms atop my upturned feet. This was the activation pose of the meditation skill. In the beta, you had to hold this pose for a whole 60 seconds before the buff would take effect. Since there was no way to make that kind of time once the battle started, it was quickly labeled as a worthless skill. But now I had leveled it up to 500. That probably lowered the pre-activation time. Please let me be right about that, I prayed. The system didn't respond, of course, but by the time I silently counted to 20, an icon that I hadn't seen in several months appeared on my HP gauge. It was the silhouette of a person in a Zen pose, the meditation buff. If I was to take Bohroom at his words, this buff could nullify level 2 paralyzing poison. If it didn't, that would be very bad news for me. But if I stood here and watched, the same thing would happen anyway. All I could do was trust the old man and act. I undid the lotus position, stood up, and commanded the servants behind me. Go to the storeroom and bring all the healing and antidote potions you can to the courtyard. Most of the servants shrank back towards the dining hall, looking terrified, but the oldest looking of all of them said bravely, I understand. Come you lot, let's go. And lifted up her long skirt to run up for the east wing. Her younger co-workers, properly chastised, shared a brief look before rushing after her. I started running without a backward glance. I would have loved to jump down into the courtyard from the window, but the fallen scouts would spot me. I wanted to get at least one by surprise. I sprinted for the end of the west wing, sending my second message to Asuna in the meantime. Make sire, all three of you have med buff before going down to courtyard. I sent, too quickly to bother correcting my typos. Based on the present time, it had been about 50 minutes since they began meditation training. If the training was over the moment the bell started clamoring, then none of these instructions mattered. But the fact that there had been no response was a sign that the training still continued, I assumed. I had a feeling that the matter of whether Asuna's group gained the meditation skill or not, or whether they could utilize it in time for the fight or not, would be key to the victory or defeat. On I rushed from the main building to the west wing, leaping down the stairs 10 at a time, when all of a sudden I heard the memory of my partner's voice in my head. You're not going to rush off without a word at me again. You must be within my sight for all 24 hours. Is that understood? That had been 3 days ago, after we talked with the DKB officers in the inn room in Station. I'd kept her command since then, excepting only of unavoidable situations, like the hot springs changing room, but I'd assumed that Castle Galley was safe and apparently let down my guard. Asuna told me not to watch them train, but there were all those bookcases in the library. I could have just waited around the corner of one. And right during that lax hour, as if I specifically timed, the fallen elves attacked. It was a coincidence, of course, but it felt like a sign. I picked up speed, trying to outrun my foreboding, and blazed through the side of the door at the end of the West Wing's first floor. I had to put on the brakes, satisfying as it had been just to kick down the door and rush through it. Instead, I opened it just a bit to check the presence of nearby enemies. Because the side door was quite close to the interior wall, if I went out, heading along the wall, I should reach the scouts throwing the poison needle soon, but it was only 3:30 in the afternoon, and there was little darkness that would hide my presence. I couldn't wait until nightfall for cover. Obviously, I just had to draw my blade and head out into the open. A wall of sound met me there, swords clashing and bellows of combat enraged. I hunched against the noise and ran along the wall to my right. The round hollow that entirely swallowed Castle Galley was a bit over 200 meters across, and the spring that had fed the spirit tree in the middle of its ground was about 30 meters wide, so that made about 80 meters from castle wall to the hot spring. The defensive line of the castle guard had already been pushed back over half of the way. If they managed to break into the castle, it would be very difficult to prevent the fallen from reaching the treasure room on the 4th floor of the main castle building, where the 4 sacred keys were currently held. We had to stop them in the courtyard, and eliminating the fallen scouts throwing their paralyzing needles was paramount. As soon as I saw the first scout ahead of me, I went from staying low and quiet to a full-on spring. The scout sensed me and turned, wearing a mask with only holes for eyes. He pulled a black pick from his belt and wound his arm back. When I saw the glint of the throwing needle, a memory of 3 nights ago flashed back in my memory. The feeling of being helpless on the ground, unable to move a finger, staring up at the horrifying sight of Morche approaching, became a liquid cooler than ice that shot through my veins. But I gritted my teeth, withstanding the fear, and readied my sword of Eventide on high. The fallen scout's hand blurred, a spine of Schmargor, coated with level 2 paralyzing poison, rushed for my chest. Whistling faintly, it was too late to dodge or defend. If my meditation buff didn't protect against this paralysis, I was going to land helpless on the ground in the midst of the chaotic battle. There was a light impact below my left collarbone. A dark bolt appeared out of the lower corner of my eye, but I cut off my sense of touch and sight, focusing entirely on my mind and the sword in my hand. The blade shone blue. The invisible hand of the system assistants pushed my body. No, paralysis! Go, I shouted. The word trap behind closed lips, and I activated the 4-part slash skill, vertical square. The scout's eyes widened just a bit when he realized I wasn't paralyzed. He reached behind his waist for a dagger, but it was too late. My first blow struck the scout's left shoulder, leaving a shining vertical line in the air. In a single moment, my sword bounced back upward, completing slashes straight down and straight up, leaving parallel visual effects from head to toe. These 3 slashes took down nearly 60% of the scout's HP. Then, my sword returned to its original position and arched farther, nearly to my back, before unleashing the devastating 4th strike. Once again, I felt the hilt of the sword of Eventide trembling in the palm of my hand, but rather than fighting against the sword's will, I added a boost of force to its adjusted course. Zoom! The elf upgraded blade dug itself heavily into the fallen scout's breast. The weak point critical blow obliterated his remaining 40%. The completed square of blue light slashed brighter and dispersed, and a moment later, the scout's body shattered into countless pieces too. I'd killed over 10 fallen elves since the start of the Elf War campaign quest. It was a simple matter, of course, as I had to do it to finish the quest, or so I had always assumed, but that probably still counted as a kind of murder. Regardless, I couldn't stop now. I was helping the Dark Elves, and I had to protect Asana, Kismel, and Mia from harm. Asana treated the NPCs as even more human than I did, and she wouldn't hesitate at all to fight against the Fallen. Through the polygons melted into the air, I saw the other 2 fallen elf scouts throwing their needles at the guards from the other side of the castle gates. I couldn't imagine that they hadn't noticed my attack, but for now, they prioritized helping their comrades fight farther in. For just an instant, I glanced left and saw that there were now slightly more red cursors for fallen elven warriors than yellow cursors for castle guards. Before my gaze could return to the 2 scouts, I noticed something and squinted. The fallen elf combatants, dressed in all black and fighting with their backs to me, had something odd tucked into their sword belts. There were narrow rods with brilliant green shards of something tied to the top. No, those were not actually artificially fashioned objects. They were tree branches. The branches were about 1/3 of a meter in length, with leaves at the end, as though broken off of a nearby tree. I would think twice of any player carrying around the same thing, but the fact that these were fallen elves changed the situation. They, like all elves, could not harm living trees. I remember General Nulza saying as much in a submerged dungeon on the 4th floor, where the fallen elves were secretly buying lumber from humans.
Eons since we were removed from the blessings of the holy tree, yet we are still bound by the taboos of the elven race.
The circuit of how the Fallen had moved through the canyons was definitely contained in those branches. However, they had circumvented the taboo. They seemed to be protected by a kind of personal barrier cast forth by the branches, which meant their next likely move was... Gah! A scream from the courtyard distracted me. A dark elf guard at the front line of combat collapsed on the ground, struck down by a fallen elven warrior curved blade. Before his companions could reach out to him, his body turned to blue shards and vanished. Damn! I swore, banishing the mystery of the branches from my head. Our first priority was to turn the tide of battle. My meditation buff would eventually wear off. I had to eliminate the other 2 scouts before it did. I switched my sword to my left hand and pulled out my paralyzing needle stuck under my collarbone. It was still usable, so I wound up and threw it at one of the scouts located near the right gate tower. Until I used meditation skill and my 5th skill slot, I'd been considering putting throwing knives in there. Thankfully, even without it active, the needle still managed to land in the right leg of the scout, who was it was a nice stationary target. He didn't seem to have any paralyzing defense himself, and he collapsed without a sound after a green border appeared around his cursor. The other one rushed to give his partner a potion, but I was already charging at full speed again. The last scout gave up on his curing of his partner and readied a dagger. I gave him a simple high slice. He evaded with a backstep rather than guarding it, but I was expecting that. When I froze briefly following my big swing, the scout deftly darted forward and whipped his dagger at me. This fierce blow was a fair bit sharper than I'd seen from the fallen thus far, but I was already lunging into his range, so I could pull off Flash Blow, the basic martial arts skill I used against Morche. The dagger grazed my right shoulder while my left fist slammed into his side. The NPC and monster algorithms, whether intended or not, had a habit of responding just a bit slower to sudden uses of a different type of attack skill. Ugh! Flash Blow's damage wasn't much to speak of, but the scout grunted and froze. This would be my chance to use a sword skill, but instead, I reached around the scout's back with my free hand. As I expected, my fingers brushed what felt like a tree branch. I grabbed it and pulled it out of his belt. I didn't expect this to cause the fallen elf to immediately collapse. After all, we were in the courtyard beneath the spirit tree's protection. They wouldn't need the branch unless they went out of the gate. But the scout's eyes bulged behind the mask as he shouted hoarsely, "Give it back!" Before he could scramble and lunge for it, I held the tip of my sword in eventide to the elf's throat and demanded, "How did you get this branch?" "That is nothing you need to know, human!" The elf spat, lowering his weapon in favor of dialogue. There were fires of hatred in his eyes. "And what business does your kind have in this fight? The enmity between elves has nothing to do with humankind." "Your kind," I repeated, sensing something off about this. I glanced around, but the only figure nearby was a third scout paralyzed. Asen and Mia had not joined the battle. The scout clicked his tongue angrily that he apparently spoken too much. He leaped backward to get away from the tip of my sword and reached his dagger again. Sensing that I wouldn't get any more information out of him, I held the branch high in my free hand. The moment his gaze traveled upward to follow it, I tossed it to the side and lunged. The scout looked back, but it was enough to delay his reaction. I took advantage of this, using the close-range 3 skill sharp nail. 3 slashes of red light, like a claw of a fierce beast, glowed in the scout's chest, and he flew backward, slamming against the castle's wall. When he bounced back to me, I added the single strike horizontal. His torso cut in two. The scout silently came to an unnatural stop in midair and disappeared. I turned around as the shards enveloped me and ran. The paralyzed scout had another branch behind his back, too. The paralyzing status wasn't wearing off anytime soon, but the eye that was visible from this angle speared me with a look sharper than a throwing needle. He would eventually recover, so I couldn't just leave the scout untouched. If I simply pierced him through the heart while he was immobile, the continual piercing damage would be enough to kill him. Instead, I stopped myself from raising my sword any further. Perhaps it was pointless fixation, perhaps even a harmful emotion. But I just couldn't bring myself to execute a helpless enemy like it was some kind of insect. The scout had pockets for throwing needles on either side of his leather belt, and there were 10 spines of Smargor still inside them. I removed them all, stuck them in my own carrying pouch, and took away his branch and the dagger, and tossed them into my inventory. I also found the other branch I'd tossed, and turned to inspect the battle. Paralyzing needle sabotage was over, but the defensive line was pushed back to barely 15 meters from the hot spring. If the guards fell into the water, the line would collapse and the enemy could rush through. Once that happened, they could be at the castle entrance in moments. There were about 25 fallen elven warriors in combat, and not even 20 castle guards fighting them back. About 10 were paralyzed and dragged to the rear, and there were no more guards rushing out of the castle. This was the full combat force of Castle Galli, because sadly, I didn't expect that Count Gallian himself would come rushing down to turn the tide of battle. A few seconds later, I had to lay of the battle and pulled the paralyzing needles out of my pocket, intent on making good use of them. There were 9 needles, plus the 2 I recovered from Morche and the 2 of the fallen who attacked Mia's home left behind, for 13 in total. If I could knock out 10 warriors with those, we could turn this battle around. I aimed for the back of the closest target and threw. The needle landed right on target, in the gap between the armor pieces. The warrior froze for a moment, then continued swinging his scimitar, as though nothing had happened. What? I held my breath, then noticed an unfamiliar icon on the warrior's HP bar. It looked like a black leaf. Perhaps it was a paralysis-resistant buff? I suppose with all the needles that the scouts were throwing from behind, a few might hit their own side, so it would make sense for them to have some kind of safety measure against that. But it also felt like a very clever strategy, almost too clever for NPCs. And for another thing, I still didn't know how the fallen elves had gotten through the gates. I was sleeping in the dining hall when the bell woke me up, but I recalled first hearing the normal tolling of the opening of the gates. Only after a few moments did it turn into a rapid alarm bell. Did that mean the guards had opened the gates for someone who was allowed in, and then the fallen rushed through? But there was no place to hide in the long, dusty canyon leading up the gates. If dozens of enemies were running from the start of the canyon, there would be still time to let the guests in and close the gates before they arrived. There was only one possibility. Whoever got the gates to open was in cahoots with the fallen, and at this moment, there was only one group of players this far along the Elf War campaign quest: Quasak. If they went into the castle and took over the tower gate room, they could ensure the gate remained open long enough for the fallen to arrive. Is that really it? I asked myself, unable to believe it. I turned and raced to the nearby gate tower, and opened the metal reinforced door. I thrust my sword into the open space, but there was no one inside. If the dark elf who would have been here was murdered, there was no way for me to search for evidence. I looked up to see that the tower chamber was packed with gears and weights and such over my head. On the wall, straight ahead, was a wooden lever. I yanked it with all my strength. With a heavy rumble, the gears overhead began to turn. That should at least close the gate and ensure that any potential fallen reinforcements outside couldn't get in. I was worried about where Quasak might have gone, but the battle in the courtyard was the most pressing matter at the moment. I leaped out of the tower and raced for the line of battle. If the paralyzing needles weren't going to work on those fallen elven warriors, my trusty sword would have to do. Rah! I roared, power surging from deep in my gut, giving up my back attack advantage. 3 nearby enemies turned around and closed the gap. I hurtled into the middle of them, getting as close as I possibly could before activating the sword skill Horizontal Square. I didn't do as much damage to a single target as Vertical Square did, but it did have a better accuracy and a wider range. The sequence of 4 horizontal slashes hit all 3 warriors, taking 2/3 of their health, hurling them backward. If I could use this newly learned skill over and over, I could probably take them all down, but it sadly had a cooldown timer to match its considerable strength, and I wouldn't be able to use it again for a bit. I would have to make full use of the sword skills I'd learned so far. There were over 20 foes here, and if I got surrounded, I was instantly dead meat. 2 more enemies noticed my presence behind them. I used the long-range jumping attack Sonic Leap on one of them. That warrior guarded the attack, but his scimitar was weaker than the sword of Eventide. And he faltered, unable to withstand the full brunt of my charge. The instant that hateful post-skill delay let up, I used the martial arts kick Water Moon on the faltering warrior. My instinct measured the distance of the other enemy behind me. I spun and activated the 2-part horizontal arc. The slashes left sideways V in the warrior's chest. He flew through the air with a grunt. It was too bad I couldn't deliver him a finishing blow, but if I spent too much time on one foe, I would get surrounded. The 3 knocked down by my horizontal square were getting up by now. I noticed, and so I used the low to the ground charging attack Rage Spike on one of them. My sliding dash was so close to the ground that it practically army crawled. The warrior tried to use a basic scimitar skill, Reaver, to fight back. If it hit me, not only would my skill fail, but I would be in a mid-stun status. So I twisted as I ran, trying to escape the path of the Reaver. On the other hand, if I stayed too far from the right motion, it would automatically fumble my sword skill. The pale blue shine coating my sword flickered, letting me know that the technique was in danger of running out.
Yeah!
The warrior roared, swinging down his blade that glowed with a sinister orange. The razor-sharp tip grazed my chest, taking about 5% of my HP with it. But in return, my sword severed his leg from the base. The warrior's remaining HP were gone, and his slender form crumbled like fine glass. The beautiful, horrendous sound effect seemed to draw on the attention of all the other fallen, fighting in the vast courtyard. One especially large one in the center of the fighting, who seemed to be the commanding officer, pointed his scimitar, more like a long saber, and shouted,
"Get rid of the impediment first! Surround him on 4 sides and crush him!"
Instantly, 4 virtually unharmed warriors peeled off the line and came rushing for me. That opened a hole in their line, of course, but the fallen still had the higher number. One of the guards shouted, "Protect the swordsmen!" But it would be difficult for them to break through the fallen line, even with the hole. I had to deal with these 4 by myself. In fact, if I could just get through this oncoming rush, it would turn the numbers in our favor and make victory a possibility. The fallen elves slid smoothly around me on either side. I still couldn't use horizontal square, my one good wide-range attack, so I backed off, looking for the right target to strike, but they were all dressed in matching black gear and hoods, with about the remaining same HP, so it was impossible to choose an obvious answer. Behind the 4, though, the warriors whose HP I'd halved were now retreating to the wall and drinking what appeared to be healing potions. If they got back to full health and the 4 surrounding me turned to 8, it would be difficult to even escape, much less wipe them out. The worst mistake to make in this situation was to be too hasty, knocking down the enemy numbers and stop moving. As with monsters, the common wisdom was to keep moving, avoid being surrounded, and grind the enemy HP bit by bit. If this happened in a dungeon, other players might get mad because you could easily build a mob train by drawing the attention of more and more monsters. But manners didn't mean anything here. I sucked in a sharp breath and pounced off the stone ground, sprinting after the target I chose on pure instinct. The enemy raised his scimitar diagonally in defensive position, while the other 3 rushed behind me. Their reaction speeds and teamwork were much better than monsters, though one should expect that much. The only plus, for whatever it was worth, was that none of the fallen elven warriors had gear or shields. Such fighters were difficult to break down, but these ones only had metal light armor and their curved swords, which meant I could get past their defenses. I charged straight ahead, sword hanging from the right of my hand. The warrior's eyes seemed to waver, losing their nerve. Perhaps he intended to defend my first blow, but charging without an attack stance was introducing an element of uncertainty to an AI's algorithm. When I was 2 meters away, the warrior finally entered an attack stance. I accelerated as best I could and thrust out my open hand with my fingers formed in the shape of a capital C. I made sure to let the enemy scimitar slip through the narrow gap and dispelled the primal fear of losing my finger as I clenched down hard. There was a silver slash in my hand, and I felt my grip and the warrior's sword become fused into one. I yanked the weapon out of the enemy's hand and flipped it around to grasp the hilt. This was the weapon snatching skill, Empty Wheel, which I acquired by my martial arts skill, Reach Proficiency 100, right in the middle of this very battle. Naturally, it was my first time using it, and if I hadn't ponied up the dough for Argo's info on the martial arts, I might have not realized that I had it available until the battle was over. "How dare you, knave!" he snarled, the warrior who lunged for his weapon. I swiped at his arm and with the Sword of Eventide and scored 7 severed part bonus. The warrior moaned, clutching his partial missing arm. I kicked him over and spun around. The other 3 warriors showed no sign of slowing down after seeing my weapon snatching trick. Shah! I blocked a black traced diagonal slash with the scimitar in my offhand. The sparks of that impact slashed off my face as I slammed my sword into his side. Sensing another attack to my right, I used the sword to block the horizontal strike. The warrior faltered, and I slashed at his neck with the scimitar I'd captured, then rushed through the gap between the two. As long as I had the Sword of Eventide in my right hand and the Fallen Elf Scimitar in my left, I was in a regular equipped state, which meant I couldn't use any sword skills. But in a 1-on-4 battle, I didn't want to use any major skills that might lead a significant movement delay afterwards. On the contrary, having a sword in each hand gave me more options for defense. I couldn't help but think that if I was going to these lengths, I could have just kept a shield around for my quick change mod, but I was still good enough to block the quick light slashes of the Fallen with a sword. Plus, I felt like it was suited to me, having two swords so I could pull off the block and counter move with either hand. Spinning around, I told myself that if I got through this fight, I would seriously think about practicing with two swords. I found the unharmed fourth warrior in front of me, with two more damaged, but fairly healthy warriors coming from behind him. The one whose scimitar I stole rushed back towards his healing comrades, perhaps to borrow a weapon. According to their cursors, their HP had already healed back up close to 70%. There was maybe a minute left until they were fully healed. I had to beat these three before then, but could I do that without sword skills? I'd already shown them everything I had. It wasn't a question of whether I could do it or not. I just had to do it. Standing still, it would only get me surrounded, so I focused on the warrior on my right and charged. They must have learned from my tendencies to attack the sides. However, as they changed directions too, to ensure that they would all be coming head on. But if I kept turning to the right, eventually I would get trapped against the castle wall. Do I pull back? No, I don't have time. I have to go straight into the melee. I hope I find the route to victory. I was just about to launch into an all-or-nothing gamble when I heard a voice. "Kirito, watch out!" For an instant, I thought I was just hearing things, but my body reacted on instinct, hurtling me to the left. Crimson red shone past my eyes. The brightest visual effect I'd seen yet barreled down on the fallen elven warriors from behind the breathtaking speed. There was a silhouette in the midst of that light that I couldn't make out from the brightness. The very air roared and the stones beneath my feet trembled. The three warriors turning to follow me noticed the abnormality and spun around, but then the red light was upon them. "No!" shouted the center warrior, lifting his scimitar. The others two took similar guarding positions. Kaboom! With an explosive eruption, the center warrior rose high into the air. The two of his sides were thrown flat on the ground, and one tumbled all the way to my feet. Out of the sheer reflex, I struck him with my right-hand sword, whittling away the last bit of his red HP bar. I looked up through the exploding blue particles to see the intruder blowing past like a runway freight train come to stop in a whirlwind of dust about 6 or 7 meters away. A red hooded cape, a pleated skirt of the same color, long chestnut brown hair, and I didn't need to check her cursor to know that this was Asuna, my temporary partner. But what sword skill was that just now? I didn't recall any charging attacks with that flashy rapier category. The force and range of it were off the charts by comparison of her favorite shooting star. Huh? I instantly saw it through the dissipating cloud of dust. I gasped. The weapon that Asuna had in her hands was not the chivalric rapier she used, but an enormous lance that looked like it could be at least 2 meters long. It had a dark green leather grip, the body itself was a brilliant silver, and there was a fanciful decoration around the base. It was clearly a quite excellent weapon based on the design, but my question was not where she got it, but how she was able to wield it so well. At present, there were 4 skills involved with handling spear-type weapons. One-handed spears, two-handed spears, one-handed lances, and two-handed lances. Out of those, two-handed spears were most typical. There were few spears users overall, but I could name Cuchulainn of the Legend Braves, Okatan the Halberdier, Hokai Ikura, the trident user from the ALS, and Kwasak's Heiston, who used a glaive. All of those landed under the two-handed spear skill. There were even fewer one-handed spear users, aside from Schickenspec on the ALS. I could only think of one or two in the frontline group, but the lance skill was far rarer in the wild than even those. I had never seen a player in the frontier using a lance. The reason for this was a small selection of weapons and how difficult they were to use. The only thing that operated under the lance skill were lances and guard lances, which had a larger hilt, both of which could only thrust. Not only were they difficult to wield in battle, but whether solo, in a party, or in a raid, they were also no situation where a lance was crucial. So in the present SAO, where there was no room for picking up hobby skills, they were a waste of a good slot, in my opinion. Why? Where? What? That was all I managed to get out of my mouth from the rapid series of questions. Why do you have that? Where did you get it? What is going on with your skills? But Asuna seemed to catch the general gist of my shock, and her long delay wore off. She turned to me and shouted, "I'll explain later. Watch my back." Indeed, with the two-handed lance that was longer than she was tall, turning around would be difficult. I rushed up towards her and remembered that the two of the three warriors she bowled were still over there alive. But I didn't need to finish them off. I heard two crystalline ruptures behind my back, nearly unison. Looking over my left shoulder through a cloud of texture shards, I saw Kismel with her saber and Mia with a rapier. "Sorry for being late, Kirito," Kismel shouted, while Mia nodded her head, still covered in that leather masks. The side door to the east wing was in the distance behind them, so they must have come from that direction. I assumed the skill training had gone well, because I could see the meditation buff on their HP bars. I'd cleaned up the 3 fallen elven scouts who'd been throwing their paralyzing needles with abandon, but I couldn't guarantee that none of the remaining sword fighters had their own supply of needles. For the rest of this battle, and every other potential fight against the fallen elves, we had to have the defensive measures against paralysis. But these powerful allies coming to our aid at least made this an even fight. If Asuna could drive 1 or 2 of those heavy charge attacks with more clumps of enemies, we'd win. I just had to watch my partner's back in the meantime. "How many more seconds on that cooldown, Asuna?" I yelled, in the sword in each hand. Over my shoulder, I heard her say, 100! Got it. 20 seconds had passed since her charge, so that meant the cooldown on the skill was 2 minutes, which was reasonable for a huge attack like that one. The guards should be able to hold out that long. Plus, 5 or 6 waitresses from the castle were coming out and giving potions to the paralyzed and injured guards who weren't fighting anyone. Sadly, their medicine didn't seem capable of instantly curing level 2 paralysis, but as long as we could hold the line where it was now, they would eventually recover. "Coming from the south, Kirito!" Kismel's voice snapped me back to attention, where 4 fallen elven warriors who'd been healing up were headed this way, their HP bar only at 70% or so. The one whose scimitar I stolen was also there, with a borrowed dagger bringing up the rear. "Kismel, Mia, swing around to the sides. Kirito, handle the foes coming from the north," Asuna directed. The elf knight and the girl warrior rushed off. After watching them go, I turned around and saw 2 fallen elven warriors peel off from the battle in the front of the hot spring pool and race towards us. They were working with the 5 to the south in an attempt to pincer attack. It was 7 on 4, but I knew we couldn't lose. Whittling down the enemy numbers meant that the defensive line was steadily recovering strength and pushing back. "Stay out of this, humans!" 2 warriors leapt at us, their voices full of rage. I blocked their perfectly timed slashes with each of my swords. Yellow sparks burned my eyes, and jolts ran from my elbows to my shoulders, but I summoned all the strength in my body to resist that pressure. I promised to watch Asuna's back, and I would not give a single step. As soon as I sensed that I'd withstood the full force of the swing, I used the martial arts leg skill, Water Moon, which was only skill I could use while holding the 2 one-handed swords. One of the warriors I kicked in the stomach, stumbled, but held his ground, while the other flew off his feet and crashed to the dirt. On a sudden inspiration, I jammed the scimitar into the earth, undoing its irregular wielding status, and used my longsword to activate vertical square sword skill, which had just cleared its cooldown period. The warrior before me took all 4 slices and exploded after being thrown to the ground. When I could move again, I pulled out the scimitar and performed a series of consecutive swings on the other warrior as he rose to his feet. Of course, back in the beta, there had been players who tried dual-wielding one-handed swords. A major counterweight to the drawback of being unable to use sword skills was the fact that magical bonuses from both weapons could still apply. So if, for example, somehow 2 copies of my Sword of Eventide, I could receive a plus 14 bonus to agility, giving me a huge upgrade in mobility. But as far as I knew, the final day of the beta test, not a single player had emerged the master of art with fighting with 2 swords. I tried it out, but I found the experience of a sword in each hand to be jarring, like each half of my body was its own independent being. Ultimately, the common understanding in the beta was that at best you could use one sword to defend while using the other to attack. At that point, you might as well use a shield instead. But on the front line in a finished game, I had never seen anyone using 2 swords. If you excluded Argo, whose claws were really 2 weapons in one, even in the case of claws, you could still be only able to use them both within the confines of a sword skill. But in the moment, I had unleashed a string of 5 or 6 swings before I finally realized that I was executing those forbidden simultaneous attacks. Immediately, I was plagued by the dissociative feeling again. I accidentally dropped the scimitar from my left hand. Fortunately, the last swing was enough to reduce the warrior's HP to 0. On instinct, I turned my face away in exploding blue shards. That made a total of 6 fallen elves I'd killed since the start of the battle. I would think nothing of killing demi-human monsters like kobolds or itzothoids by the dozen, but in this case, I felt kind of strange pressure weighing on me. I shook my head, dispelling the feeling of both dissociation and faint guilt, and looked to the south. Asuna was just about to activate a new sword skill. Her 2-handed lance, glowing green, plunged toward the 5 fallen elves whom Kismel and Mia had maneuvered into one tight bunch. It wasn't powerful as her earlier charge, but the tremendous reach and sharp point pierced the fallen anyway. Then she pulled the spear back and darted forward again. One more time, a 3-part attack. Once the last metallic sound finished echoing, 3 of the fallen elves were down and bursting apart. The power was devastating. In one-on-one fight, the nimble fallen elves would be a formidable enemy, but in a large group-on-group battle, when you had the option of trapping your enemy, no weapon could be more effective. It suddenly seemed to me. But there was no way she'd learned a 2-handed spear skill since the start of the battle. Based on the power and the numbers of the sword skill she was using her proficiency, it had to be at least 100. And now that I thought of it, when we were talking about gained skills the other day, Asuna had said something odd. That brief thought was interrupted by a new bursting sound. With blindingly quick attacks, Kismel and Mia dispatched the remaining foes. The warrior whose scimitar I stole never had the chance to use the dagger he borrowed. He had turned into the fragments of data and had been deleted. We had defeated all 7 of the warriors who peeled off to attempt that pincer attack. I turned back to count the number of living enemies, and a fresh bellow rang across the open courtyard. Suda! I panicked at first, but this was not a fresh new batch of enemies, nor was it more guards coming to the rescue. The dozen-plus dark elf guards holding a desperate defense in front of the Spirit Tree Spring had all raised a yell together. I could see now that the number were roughly equal in the battle of the defensive line, and if you added the guards getting healed in the back, we actually had more. The fallen elf commander bellowed to rally his warriors too, but none responded in kind. Okay, let's beat that commander and break their... I started to say, to Asuna, when something whizzed past my eyes. Then, another, and another. What? Kismel gasped and pointed into the sky. When I followed her finger, I lost all speech. Against the backdrop of the golden blue base of the floor and Eincrad above us, countless little flakes spun and danced through the air. They were leaves. Leaves of the spirit tree, which stood over the courtyard, were withering and falling off the branch. I automatically reached out and grabbed it before it hit the ground. It was light brown and desiccated, and it crumbled in my fingers before melting into thin air. I looked up again and stared closer at the tree itself, 30 or so meters above. There was no change to its trunk at this moment, but the leaves continued falling from its branches in all directions. This couldn't be a natural phenomenon. It was January, too late in the season for the leaves to fall, and the spirit tree had never withered because it received constant life from the hot spring at the roots for centuries. It was then that my eyes gaped, and I had a terrible premonition. It couldn't be conceded that the fallen elves were attacking right as the leaves started falling off the spirit tree. If all the leaves fell at the protection of the spirit tree, as Kismel called it, I would be lost, and Castle Galley would be at the same dusty canyon outside the wall. A weakness debuff would affect all the dark elves in the castle, and the guards would obviously be unable to fight. But the fallen elves had those fresh-cut branches on their belts and could keep going. That had been their plan all along, and most likely way they could harm the spirit tree was... "Kismel, do you have your greenleaf cape?" I shouted. The knight looked back at me and startled out of her shock, but shook her head. "No, I returned it to the treasure room." "Oh, if the spirit tree withers, then..." "Right, that's what they're after. Here, Kismel, take this," I said, and quickly as possible opened my window and took out the branch I had removed from the fallen elven scout. Kismel had noticed the fallen elves wearing these things, and she looked slightly evasive. "Did they cut those branches off living trees?" "But how?" "I don't know, but this is the only option you have. If all the spirit tree leaves fall, I don't think the guards will be able to fight anymore." I pressed the leafy branch into my knight's hand, then turned to Asuna with her huge lance, Mia in her gas mask. I couldn't help but feel very worried about Asuna being here, but Kismel wouldn't abandon her comrades, and in any case, Asuna would not run away. "Just hang in there, I'll be right back." "Where are you going, Kirito?" "Underground," I shouted as I ran off. In moments, I was at full speed, racing through the fallen leaves. The guards had paused when the abnormal phenomenon started, and were starting to fight again, but the leaves would be gone within 3 minutes. There were still 15 fallen elven warriors, including their commander, and even with the 3 women present, it would be tough to eliminate them all within 3 minutes. I had to stop the withering of the spirit tree before then. I readied my sword above my right shoulder, hoping to add at least one blow before I left, steadied my aim, hearing the startup sound of the sword skill, and activated Sonic Leap. It scored a clean hit on the back of a warrior standing apart from his group, sending him tumbling. I grabbed the branch from his belt. "Aim for the branches on the fallen's backs," I shouted to the guards, and so the fallen would hear me too, and rushed past the fighting towards the front entrance of the castle. No doubt it would be difficult to aim for the branches on the enemy's backs in the midst of battle, but at the very least it should put some mental pressure on the fallen. If they lost those branches, they would be just as susceptible to weakness when the spirit tree died. I reached the entryway in seconds and handed over the branch I just stole from the waitresses helping the injured and paralyzed right next to the door. "If the spirit tree withers, gather everyone close around that branch." The range of the branch's effect would be very short, I was certain, but still enough to make a difference. Once the waitress nodded, stunned, I rushed inside. The first floor entry hall was empty. Most likely Count Galleon and the high priestesses were barricading themselves up on top of the floor. I didn't think they were going to hear out some human wanderer the way to the Viscount Euphilis's did. And if the tree withered, the Count would just be as helpless as the rest of them anyway. The stairs down in the underground hot spring were a little ways down the West Wing hallway. I curved to the left and was speeding up again when I heard a familiar voice. "Hey, boy, slow down!" I went in the double-footed brake and looked up at the direction of the voice. On the second-floor terrace of the stairs in the atrium-style entry hall was a figure in black robes, hands waving wildly. Gramps? What do you want? There's no time for... Bookroom, self-styled great sage, cut me off with a desperate, I know that! I suspect the fallen elves have dumped poison in the spring, and I know you're going down there, but you cannot fix it by yourself. Then what do we do? Pour this into the spring, he said, tossing me something that looked like it was made from glass from the terrace. If this was a quest with a proper storyline, then failing to catch the object would immediately fail the quest. I knew, so I dropped my sword and then used both hands to catch the ball of glass. It turned out to be a round bottomed flask about 10 centimeters across. There was a cork plunged tight into its short neck, and it was full of deep green liquid. Based on appearances, it was very poisonous. I wanted to ask him if this was really safe, but there wasn't a second to waste. Deciding to take the word of the sage, I properly training asana and the others in the meditation skill, I picked up my sword and made to leave. All right, I'll do it. Very good, boy. With that, I resumed running. A downward staircase appeared on the right side of the hall, and I practically tumbled down the steps to the basement. I had to be as cautious as possible while running down the hallway with its reddish lamps. The fallen could be lurking anywhere from this point on. At the end of the curving corridor was the large door to the underground hot spring. White steam wafted from the open door. Oh, I covered my mouth with my sword hand on instinct. Before it had only smelled like spring water, but now there was an unpleasant odor mixed in. Something like drying mud or a musty, moldy smell. I stopped at the entrance, listening closely before I entered. There was no one in the spacious lounge area, but the stench was sharper here. If the smell was coming from the pool the spirit tree's roots drank from, there wasn't a moment to waste. I threw open the door and raced through the empty changing rooms and went into the great subterranean dome. I clenched my jaw when I saw it. A pure, milky white water of the spring was tainted and black. Thick, sticky bubbles rose to the surface, emitting a gray miasma when they burst. The roots hanging from the dome ceiling were nearly 4/5 black, no doubt due to the sucking up the polluted water. If I didn't purify that water now, the centuries-old tree was going to die within a minute. But I couldn't move forward. Ahead of me, on the stone tile walkway, near the lip of the water, stood a man. He wore full metal armor, a short spear in his right hand, and a tower shield in his left. His face was aged, and his chin sported a short beard. It was the leader of Kwasak, Gindo. The spearman eyed me warily. "Get out of the way," I said, but Gindo just pointed his large shield in my direction and rasped, "No, I can't move until those roots have completely rotted away." That made it essentially certain that Gindo had dumped the poison into the hot spring, but the color cursor over his head was green, so whoever went into the gate room of the tower and either killed or drove out the dark elf guard so that the gate would stay open, it wasn't him. It must have been one of his 3 other companions. In any case, Kwasak had fooled me entirely. Bitter regret and sour hate flooded my mouth. "Are you helping the fallen elves, or are you part of that PK gang?" Whatever I expected out of Gindo, it wasn't this. "No way! Neither! We didn't even know that people were PKing in Aincrad, so I never suspected him of..." "Him? Who?" But I didn't have time to keep talking. There wasn't a second to waste. In the courtyard just above us, Asana, Kismel, and Mia and the guards were fighting desperately to save the castle. From what I could see, their HP bars. They hadn't lost too much, but if the spirit tree died and the guards could no longer fight, my party members would be in grave danger. "I don't have time to talk with you. If you don't move now," I said, lifting my sword and pointing it at the man who stood 5 meters away, "I will move you by force." If I attacked Gindo, who had a green cursor, mine would turn orange, but I would do the alignment recovery quest as many times as it took to keep Asana and the others alive. In response, Gindo adjusted his tower shield, which stood over 1 meter tall. He wasn't going to budge until that tree had withered up. it wouldn't be easy to break through his defense, but if it came down to it, I could use a series of sword skills to smash the shield. An idea popped into my head, and I looked at my sword in my right hand. I returned it to its sheath over my back without a word. I opened my window and put a flask in my inventory. When he saw me barehanded, Gindo let a flash of uncertainty cross his face. I did not miss. Instantly, I was flying. Gindo frantically tried to raise his short spear, but I jumped to the right, hunching into the blind spot of his right shield created. Then I darted forward again, putting both hands on the shield and pushing with all my might. Within the anti-criminal code zone, even the strongest player could not force another player or NPC out of their personal space. The action of planting your feet in place fixed your personal coordinates and made the game treat you like any other immovable object. But outside the safe haven area, that system did not apply, and even I did not know where the line between simply pushing a person and committing a crime lay. If you push someone off a high ledge and call fall damage, you would definitely turn orange, but this seemed safe to me. Yeah! I bellowed, summoning all the power from my gut, and pushed on the heavily armored warrior, whose gear had to be twice the weight of my own. Out of a difference of strength and simple surprise, Gindo faltered backward and couldn't recover. Sliding bit by bit, he put a brief moment of resistance at the lip of the walkway, then fell back into the filthy black water. A huge plume of liquid shot up, then Gindo's face emerged from the water. He spat and flailed his hands, but because of his weight of his plate armor and tower shield, he couldn't keep himself afloat. Fortunately, I supposed. The blackened water was smelly, but apparently not poisonous to players, because no debuff icon appeared on his cursor. Belatedly, I realized that if his HP ended up going down, I could have gone criminal. But at least for now, I wasn't suffering any alignment loss. I ran my fingers across my open window and materialized the flask I had just placed in it. Quickly, I popped the cork out and poured the green liquid into the hot water. White smoke practically exploded out of the water where it landed, causing me to turn my face away. Gindo's struggling figure was engulfed in the smoky steam. The reaction quickly spread across the vast pool of water, painting white over my entire field of view. It reminded me of a prank I played as a kid with my little sister Sugaha, when we dumped a huge block of dry ice into the bath water. "I hope you know what you're talking about, Gramps," I muttered. There was no response, of course, but a few seconds later, the first change I noticed was not in the sight of the spring, but the smell. The stench hanging thick in the dome rapidly began to reverse, replaced by a fresh, woody smell, like a forest after the rain. Eventually, the white cloud dispersed, allowing me to see once again. Within moments, the poisonous swamp of the hot spring underwent a dramatic transformation. The greenish water was now clear again, the paved stone floor crisply visible, and the nasty smell was completely gone. The bundles of hanging roots from the ceiling were still blackened at the top, but even that was slowly fading. It seemed that we had avoided the nightmare scenario of the spirit tree withering away completely. I checked the HP bars of my party members again, satisfied that they were still holding around 70%, breathed a sigh of relief. A dark elf victory was surely guaranteed at this point, but with other players involved, there was no telling what might happen next. I had to return to the courtyard and help eliminate the fallen. I turned on my heel, then paused and looked back at Gindo, who was no longer struggling. The heavy warrior, resting on his knees in the water, turned his face up towards mine, and at the bare minimum volume needed to be audible, muttered, "Now they're all gonna die." "What? Who is?" I asked. His face was sunken, like a soul had drained out of it, with just a touch of anger and despair. "Who do you think? My friends, Lazuli, Tamu, Heiston. They've been given poison. They're being held prisoner."